and this is broadcast number 646, April the 23rd, 1984. There's a new postage stamp out. I was surprised when I went to the post office this week because I like usually the ones with the flowers and love and all that cheerful stuff. It's still a romantic at heart, but there was an interesting one and looked like abstract art until you stood it the right side up. It's for the National Archives, and on the front of it, you'll see it, and you should get some. I bought a lot of sheets and ordered more. It said, "What is past is prologue." I tried to find out today if that was a quotation of Shakespeare. It sounded familiar to me and not to the people I asked, but it's so appropriate. And they have a picture of Abraham Lincoln and a profile of George Washington. It should have been John Kennedy because of the two assassinations. And then it's got the date 1934 to 1984, I guess the date of the National Archives. That's 1 year after Hitler came to power, and that was the year when Herbert Hoover was swinging us into the depths of depression while he was arming Europe for World War II. And of course, the National Archives became very important because that's where you could lock information up for 50 years, or you can't see it until after you're dead. Your children can see the stories of Oswald and the Kennedy assassination, and the Warren Commission decided it would be locked up for so many years. Not in our lifetime would we get to see if there was proof that Oswald did it alone. The National Archives is the excuse now for locking up in a fascist state evidence that would prove that the people in office are murderers and assassins. Only Herbert Hoover could have thought of such a thing. If you study the history of Herbert Hoover and his background, it's apropos that it became the repository for some things you can get out and some are sanitized, but the National Archives became the repository of the state secrets. So they tell you what is past is prologue, but you can't see the past, so you got to get into the prologue. Now, we begin the program each week with what we were talking about 1 year ago tonight. That was April 25th, broadcast 594 in 1983. I was talking about the importance of Antarctica and space stations, reviewing that, and the story of Adolf Hitler's diary was in the news last year. This year, the name of the people involved with the Hitler diary, they're in the news again. The money that they were paid for is not accounted for, and another article said it went to the Waffen SS. Those are the members of the Death's Head, the select group of Hitler's entourage, and that 3.8 million that disappeared for the diaries went to support the members of the Waffen SS who are still alive in Germany. I talked about John Meyer, who was fighting extradition to Los Angeles. He was framed in Los Angeles for the murder of Alfred Wayne Neuter in 1974 at the Beverly Hills Hotel. John's been sitting in the jail in Los Angeles downtown for 3 months. He worked for Richard Nixon. He worked for Howard Hughes. He was a prominent person in terms of geology and mining, and he broke with the Republicans at the time of Watergate and offered the Democrats, George McGovern, and the Democrats information about Bibi Rebozo and the secret funding of the Hughes organization that would have broken the back of Richard Nixon. He wouldn't have been reelected at that election. The Democrats turned their back on him, the dirty sleazes. They would not use his information. And, of course, the Republicans hated him, so he got it from both ends. The people he tried to help wouldn't receive it, and the people he was turning on got even with him, and he's sitting down in a jail in Los Angeles. I saw him when I was in L.A. about a month and a half ago, and I'll update more on that story later. I was talking about some important connections that I wrote about later in Rebel in November of the Young Americans for Freedom, and they're being brought from Munich, Germany, to Dallas, Texas, and the links of Joe McCarthy and Navy intelligence and Robert Morris. Most of you have that article that I wrote for Rebel, or if you don't, I can send you reprints and let you know about that. That was just a year ago. Tonight I was talking about that, and just this week, or last week, Mr. Harvey Robert Bright, one of the men who paid for that ad that smeared John Kennedy, that worked with the Young Americans for Freedom and the Munich Nazis, he just bought the football team in Dallas, Texas. Mr. Bright was a strong member of the Birch Society, paid part of the ad. He bought the Dallas Cowboys, the NFL franchise, this last week. He said, "I'm not ashamed to admit that I helped pay for that Weissman page in the Dallas News the day that Kennedy came to town. I'm a conservative and I'm proud of it. Remember, they referred to it as the Weissman ad. Bernard Weissman testified, he was the only one at the Warren Commission, said they used me because my name was Jewish and I didn't know the organization. But everyone he worked with were Nazis from the American military brought from Munich, Germany, with direct link to Hitler's Nazis and the American John Birch Society that Larry McDonald then became the head of and was still the head when he was killed in the plane crash in September of last year. The Young Americans for Freedom and the route of those people with William Buckley and the connections to Senator Joe McCarthy, that's what we were talking about a year ago tonight. And of course, I'll update the McCarthy era with John Reese and Louise Reese and go into a Western Gold story that broke this week because Louise Reese it was working for Senator Joe McCarthy and then went from his work and investigating people and allegedly calling them, communists and smearing them, blacklisting them. She went on to work for the late Larry McDonald, who was the head of the Birch Society, and into a lot of other things too, and Western Goals. And her husband then became co-founder of Western Goals, that notorious organization that I talk about so frequently on the air. I also referred to Walter Harnischfeger from Nazi Germany and from Wisconsin, who put the money behind Joe McCarthy to run in the Senate, and then McCarthy released the Nazis from the Malmedy trial. Harnischfeger's name was in Wall Street Journal just a couple of months ago. They're in trouble. They're restructuring their debts. I can't cry for them. It says Milwaukee, the Harnischfeger Corporation, those were the ones behind Senator Joe McCarthy, signed an agreement with lenders to restructure the company's $185 million debt. So maybe their karma is coming through. Their debt package from the company's international operations, chiefly Harnischfeger, capital G, small m, small b, capital H, West Germany, is one of their offices. And I wrote in my article in the Rebel, and also for the 007 article, about the links of Joe McCarthy to these Nazis. And one of his close friends of the Harnischfeger, the nephew of this Harnischfeger, was a friend of Adolf Hitler and walked around with an autographed book of Adolf Hitler. So that's what we were talking about last year, and now the Joe McCarthy team is very much operational or with the Western Goals and continuing the blacklisting, or trying to, although there may be an injunction against some of their material, and we'll get to that in a second. I do want to update you on Larry Flynn. I get calls and letters, and I want to tell you what is going on there because it is horrendous. I sent him a letter about a week and a half ago, and I got a return. It came back to me this week. The U.S. Department of Justice Federal Prison System to Mae Brussell regarding Larry Flynn. It said, this individual is not allowed to receive mail from you or correspond with you. You may protest this rejection and refer it to another official. He's not allowed to get anything from me. In the meantime, there's been a bitter battle about the conservatorship of his franchise, the distribution of his magazines, the Flint distribution, which is supposed to be second to Annenberg's. There were stories that one reason he got shot was the competition with Annenberg in distributing magazines, other than just the ones such as Chic or Hustler. There's a big fight. His brother, Jimmy, right now is in charge of the operations, and of course I have no more to do with them or anybody down there. The tragic thing is an article that came out. It's just a little rag sheet, the Globe, but yet it reaches a lot of people. I've written for the Globe and the Examiner, and it reaches people, grocery stores and liquor stores, and they have a story that came out this April. How much longer must we stomach this obscene blot on America? He's public enemy number one. And there's a picture of Larry Flint, and it tells about how there's violence against Ronald Reagan, and they're trying to blame this David Mahonsky, Mahonski, who was in front of the White House with a shotgun, who wanted to kill Reagan. You remember the broadcast that I did on him? It was broadcast number 641, where I said the day that he was there among Secret Service agents, there was Mr. Keith Bushey, Bushey, from Los Angeles Police Department on the grounds of the White House, when this particular brainwashed zombie was saying that he wanted to get in and kill Reagan. They have a list of all these people that wanted to break into the White House and kill Ronald Reagan, And of course, they're blaming Larry Flynt for all of those. And in the custody of the federal penitentiary, they could get him to say, I wanted to kill Ronald Reagan, and now they're blaming all these other murders. But then they go one step further, and they use a Dr. William Logan, the staff psychiatrist of the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, to tell you what Larry Flynt thinks and what he feels. Now, it's hard as hell to get information from a psychiatrist on a patient, but when the federal government wants to smear somebody, they use them, put them into a prison, and then quote Dr. William Logan, Logan. Well, he'll probably be chief psychiatrist of the United States Army someday for the services he's doing. But he's giving interviews to Globe magazine on a patient who was drugged and taken into the federal system and is isolated, and the crimes that he did, such as wearing the flag as a diaper and so forth, he cannot get mail and he can't get it from me. So he's right now they've moved him to Washington, D.C. They'll put him close to John Hinckley and make matters worse and scramble his brains. The whole thing is a mess. But that's what happens when you get into the idea of publishing this kind of material and you don't have a plan or strategy to defend yourself. You don't go into an operation like that unless you know your enemy, and obviously he didn't. Joseph Kraft had a story. I don't use columnists too much or refer to them, but he ran an article about a week and a half ago, A Look at Sleaze. Of course, that's a popular word for this election that's coming up and the people in office now. But he went to the dictionary and looked up the definition of sleaze, which is exactly what I did. I thought it was an interesting thing to do. And he has marked by cheapness of character, garish, disreputable, slimy, greasy, and so forth. And then he gives the first example. He lists all of them. We won't go over them again. But he said, to clarify the distinction, honoring Frank Sinatra at the White House, for instance, is not criminal. The singer is not under indictment or anything of that kind, but his well-known association with gangster element holding up for public admiration is the reverse of good taste. It's sleazy. And that's what I said from the time the Reagans were in office. I referred to them as high society, the very high society. When you get people like Johnny Carson or particularly Frank Sinatra giving the inaugural ball, then anything else, you don't have to bother to explain who these people are or what's going on. You may have a good voice, but it is beyond sleaziness, but it sets the tone for how much you can get away with in this country and who you know and how you can wheel and deal and give the inaugural ball for those creds that got into the White House. Another thing of sleaze is the Hells Angels are going to hoist the Olympic torch. Why shouldn't they? They're American citizens. I guess you may ask that. The Hells Angels were sleazy during the anti-war period, and they were hired by Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese from the Justice Department in California to take their bikes and plow into the crowds to break up the anti-war people, the demonstrators, where the ships were going out of Oakland with napalm and deathly weapons. The Hells Angels were part of the Reagan sleazy operation in California, and they were hired by Melvin Belli and that group to be the security guards at Altamont, where the camera was focused on this poor fellow who was stabbed while the Rolling Stones were singing, and they made a movie, Give Me Shelter. You know, that was the end of the hippie movement, the peace-loving, the Woodstock. You know, it was from Helter Skelter to Give Me Shelter. That's the title of the long article I did that could be book length on the breaking of the rock musicians, music as politics, and going from the Beatles in the intent of peace that Lennon wanted to writing Give Me Shelter, the Helter Skelter all over the Manson family door by white, church-going Chuck Watson from Texas, the Eagle Scout, the devout Christian boy, writing in blood to make it look like the blacks did it, you know, the pigs and Helter Skelter, and link the Beatles with violence. It was from Helter Skelter to Give Me Shelter. And so now the Olympics are the Hells Angels will be part of the torch carrying for the Olympics to welcome the people to the United States with Hells Angels. They were involved with violence, with drugs, with murders, with beating people up. I mean, they're not the epitome of what society or fair play or Olympics was, but they will carry the torch because if anyone's got $1 in this country, you can do anything you want. That's all you have to do is have $1 and be an anti-communist, and you're part of the league. Another example of sleaze that was in the news this week, and I'll be doing a great deal more on that, is the federal grand jury probing bribes and allegations against Bechtel Corporation. Well, when you hit Bechtel, you get our present Secretary of Defense, and you get Caspar Weinberger and George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. George Shultz was former president of Bechtel from 1975 to 1974, and Caspar Weinberger was special counsel and vice president of Bechtel 1975 to 1980. Now, that little bitty money that went over to Korea wasn't so horrendous, and I think they're watergating the team around Ronald Reagan to get in the Kissinger, Kramer, Haig gang. Haig is mad at all of them and saying he couldn't get through the doors to the president, and he's bad-mouthing and writing a book and lecturing on he's a poor team player, but he must know the team is going to be shaken up a little. So two of the biggies, we've got all kinds of sleaze. And the L.A. District Attorney said he may prosecute Mr. Wick, Charles Wick, who's really Mr. Zwick, Z-W-I-C-K, of the U.S. Information Agency for the wiretapping in California. I don't have time tonight. I won't go into all the sleazy new investigations about Ronald Reagan, but I'm adding them up and we'll roll them out as they come along. And now I want to get on to a continuation of what I did last week, because it's going to have a pattern that's going to follow through the Olympic Games, the plans for violence, the inner teams working on that. And it has to do with Edwin Meese. The bottom line is Edwin Meese, who worked with John Reese, still does, wants to be the Attorney General. I read you the FBI report on Sleazy Reese last week, how they didn't like him or didn't trust him, and he has all that weight with the military. But now I'm going to continue to refresh your mind in case you didn't hear it last week, and I don't usually do this, but there's a continuity that there is every week, but particularly there's a series that I'm going to keep running along and getting back to. We talked about the police were ready for the Olympic defectors, and there's more this week. How William Simon, the president of the United States Olympic Committee, is also on the board of a group that makes laser weapons for Daniel Graham of High Frontier. Mr. Simon was Secretary of Energy, appointed by E. Pendleton James, who's in the Nixon team, who James arranged the money for the homes for Meese and get their household and get them out of their bind. Mr. Simon was Secretary of the Treasury, which was Secret Service. He's on the board of Helionetics, that I'm going to mention often and weave in and out of the next 8 or 9 broadcasts. And he's with Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, who's on the board of Western Goals, and we'll do more on that tonight, and Robert Keith Gray. There's a lot of people with Helionetics making the lasers for the Star War contracts, but those 4 are important because Robert Keith Gray is the man who arranges Mrs. Meese's positions. He got her on the board of a William Moss Institute where she could get $40,000 a year. She's on the board of the American University, trustee there in Washington, that was funded $90,000 to study the pornography of Larry Flint's magazine, Hustler, and also Playboy. They couldn't single out Hustler because Larry Flint was after Ed Meese and with the Vicki Morgan tape, so they have to take in Playboy and Penthouse. Robert Keith Gray was active with a lot of areas of counterintelligence, and he was part of the Task Force 157 with Wilson and Turple. To just tell you that Helionetics had those men on the board, William Simon, Edward Teller, Robert Keith Gray, and Admiral Hayward, who works at Litton Industries at the present time. And last week I gave you a list of members of Western Goals. If you didn't hear the broadcast or want the list, send me a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll send you this list of people on the board of Western Goals, or you may get it from your library. Now, that was last week's broadcast. Now, this week there were some huge stories. I don't mean 1 column or 2 columns, but huge stories. One important one was April the 19th, Los Angeles Times. Defections, a touchy matter for the Olympic Games. They are having trouble. Remember, I mentioned last week that they want to help them defect. The Los Angeles Police Department is getting ready to provide protective custody until the proper agencies arrive. And this is how a group of people are going to try to get the Soviet athletes and their trainers and translators. There's a coalition that is protesting against the downing of the Korean airline, and they're asking these people to defect. Defections, a touchy matter. The the activities are being set up, and this was about a half a page article on the way the Eastern European coalition and the plans for the defections. As a matter of fact, the Soviet Union has asked that a particular gentleman who's arranging this, a Mr. Balsiger, be put in protective custody if they're going to come to the Olympic Games, because he's planning this massive defection. Another large article, anti-Soviets vow that the protest will be a major Olympic event. And this is where it really gets scary. This David Balsiger has organized the Baltic American Freedom League, the Polish American Congress, the Hungarian Freedom Fighters, the Afghanistan Freedom Organization, the Alpha 66, the anti-Sandinista Nicaraguans. Many of you might have seen, and if you didn't, it may be on your broadcast sooner or later, a television show on Reverend Moon's organizing the protesters, the anti-Sandinistas in San Francisco, the street riots, and they're going to be heavily organized by the Moon Organization, street riots, demonstrations in Los Angeles at the time of the Olympic Games. The Alpha 66 are the anti-Castro Cubans, set up by Edwin Wilson or Frank Turple and E. Howard Hunt, Theodore Shackley. They were brought here from Cuba when Batista was kicked out by Castro. They are heavily armed. They bomb New York. They bomb airports. They bomb the Russian embassy, United Nations. They bring terror in the United States. They're not arrested. They're part of our intelligence operation, and they are going to be in Los Angeles. They are planning hundreds of groups like this, if you can believe it. Hundreds of groups of people from the Baltic American Freedom League meeting the Olympic agenda. Los Angeles is going to be a zoo. And this large article is how it will be a major Olympic event, getting all these people to organize. Another large story in the Washington Post, a full half page, April 14th, 1984. Group sets safety net to snatch defectors at Olympic Games. We really shouldn't have the Olympic Games in this country if we can't be hospitable to the differences in countries. 155 supporting organizations, and they list the American Conservative Union, the Young Americans for Freedom, the American Afghan Action, the Nicaraguan Patriotic Association, the Elderly Korean Americans. The LA police are going to be there, and they will have safe houses and know where to take these people. There's a list, not a list of 155, they've given a few. But you had your chance. The Young Americans for Freedom came from Munich, Germany with General Walker to Robert Morris, who now works with Gerard O'Neill on the space stations, and you know what I've written and said about all of these people. And there are links to John Singlaub and the World Anti-Communist League and the Luftwaffe pilot, Mr. Steinholtz, the members of Western Goals. This group is serious, this group of organizers. It isn't one group, but even the Washington Post, back east, they're going to pay attention. Now, Reagan was a California problem for 8 years. He became a national problem. Nixon was out here. He became a national problem. Now it's going to be international. And the problem is just really heating up. This is only April. Another large article in the Los Angeles Herald. Soviet newspaper alleges Olympic kidnap schemes. They claim there's going to be posters in Russian telling them to go, that religious people, rabid religious people, right-wing people, are laying the groundwork, and they're going to kidnap these people. And the counteraction of the far right was, you're just using that as an excuse because they don't want to be in the Soviet Union, so you'll say we kidnapped them. And the Soviet Union said they can be taken, seized to hideouts, methods can be used. They talk about betrayal, mind control, and the fact that they will literally be kidnapped. The athletes and the coaches will be forced to defect. And the Soviet Union is talking about the plans and quoting the Los Angeles newspapers who are advertising that they're going to do this, advertising that they have the safe houses. And a large Los Angeles Herald article, April 20th. Now, along those lines is George Shultz. Ronald Reagan gave a speech on his secret directive, April the 3rd, on how to deal with terrorism. And George Shultz, again, April the 19th, followed it up with a story on terrorism will get worse. And then, of course, 2 days after Ronald Reagan's speech, that incident took place with the Libyans in London 2 days later. Now, if you are interested in social studies, in history, in politics, get yourself 6 file folders or take a newspaper and bend it in half. And every article you see, every editorial that talks about terrorism, just in generalities like terrorism is coming, put every article there. Every article that has to do with kidnapping, somebody's kidnapped or attempted kidnap, put it in that packet. Anybody who is hijacked, put it in one section. And anybody who is murdered at American embassies, whether it's the embassy in Greece or at Lebanon breaking in or Kuwait, add it up and put them in envelopes. This is the election terrorism Reichstag syndrome, and it is sprouting. It is growing. When you think that they admit to 155 organizations, and it includes the Nazis, the neo-Nazis, the Klan, the Hells Angels, what in the hell is going to go on? And George Shultz is saying there will be more terrorism. Terrorism will be the chance to round us up if all hell breaks loose. Now, Mr. George Shultz is very sure that terrorism is on the move. But I pulled out of my files, and they go this isn't back too far, July 30th, 1982, Edwin Meese, who's always the guy we're talking about now because he wants to be Attorney General, and he touches bases because California is where he and Ronald Reagan set this whole thing up and the national tone. In 1982, Friday, July 30th, San Jose Mercury, the Reagan administration is considering whether to turn over the government uranium enrichment business away from the government to private industry. On July the 7th, Edwin Meese requested that the Energy Department and 2 other agencies meet with consultants and make uranium in the hands of private people. The same Schultz and Weinberger that now have been charged or suggested, not they, but the company they were president, vice president of. Companies don't get bribes. People get bribes. Companies don't have cufflinks. People have cufflinks, and the pay is big up and over and around the table. Well, the person who objected to Edwin Meese's turning over the energy to a private company was Senator Howard Metzenbaum of Ohio, who's fighting the Meese confirmation now. Maybe he remembers back a year and a half. He said that it would constitute a major weakening of the nation's policies aimed at curbing the spread of nuclear weapons. So he's implying that Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan are encouraging the spread of it by turning it to private industry. And who would they do? Metzenbaum argued that the Bechtel Group had expressed interest in running the government's enrichment facility at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Union Carbide Corporation was recently doing a part of it, but the Bechtel would be one of the potential beneficiaries of the private companies running the uranium. This is the Bechtel company where our Secretary of Defense, who formerly Weinberger was Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare when they were doing the electrode implants and the brain experiments and the mind control throughout the prisons and the hospitals and innocent people in the United States. That's the same Weinberger who was head of HEW nationally, then head of defense and a former executive of Bechtel. And the argument was that they were concerned that these officials would play a deciding role in the American enrichment program when a former Bechtel vice president, another one, is Deputy Energy Secretary W. Kenneth Davis. W. Kenneth Davis of Energy, Deputy Secretary, is a former vice president of Bechtel, the Secretary of State official of Bechtel, George Shultz, former president of Bechtel, and Caspar Weinberger, special counsel and vice president. They want to turn over the uranium to those people. And look what they're doing in this country, in Central America and around the world, recognizing the dictatorships such as Marcos and Pinochet and Zia in Pakistan and Sir Eric Gary in Grenada, wherever they go. So that is update on the Los Angeles part of this story, but not separated from the next part I'm getting to, because this is where the action is going to take place. Now, Western Gold did come in the news this week, and it came with a very positive time, if there's time enough to continue this pursuit. There was a two-part story on Western Gold's. Actually, the first part was that suit by the American Civil Liberties Union that went on for several years with 131 plaintiffs, claiming that the Los Angeles Police Department illegally stored information about them, law-abiding citizens, that shouldn't have been in their computers, and they were suing the LAPD. And in the course of that investigation, it took a turn off to another route when they asked for the record of where these papers were. And last May, they found out that the papers were taken out of the police department into the garage and law office of the detective J. Paul of the Los Angeles Police Department. That was part one of the Los Angeles Western Gold saga, the suit against the police department, and then the investigation of J. Paul. I'll take a 1-minute break, and we'll get on back to Western Goals in 1 minute. Now we'll begin the second half of World Watches broadcast 646. This is April the 23rd, and this is the second half of the program. Now, the ACLU couldn't go too much into the Western Goals story because that was a police matter. And going on in Los Angeles, and I've been sharing with you on these programs, the Police Investigative Committee, there's 3 members of a police court, have been hearing the testimony of J. Paul of whether the superiors, going from Chief of Police Daryl Gates on down, gave permission for him to run this computer to Washington, D.C. And he said they knew all along, that they paid for some of the disks, that he was paid when he was away, that he took papers from the police intelligence to his wife, law office, Mary Love, who's very absent in this whole scenario. Her law office is not named. I'm sure it's a biggie with the Defense Department or CIA. Very silent. But anyway, that was the branch that the case took. So now people whose names were in those disks of the LAPD that went to Western Goals are suing Western Goals. Now we're where we should be. And I'm going to ask you people who get World Watchers a program to call your local newspaper. Everyone has a newspaper in their city, it doesn't matter how small it is, and ask for the news editor and the editor of the newspaper and the director of the news department, and take their name and say, this story at Western Goals and the Los Angeles Police Department has been in the news, Los Angeles Herald and Los Angeles Times, for 1 year. LA article, the ACLU suit going on for several years, but in May, the Western Goals. Now there's another lawsuit. Why don't you have it on the wire services? Every article I have coming out is from the LA Times, which I take, or the LA Herald, and other people who, if you don't read those papers, you don't know the story. So here is the latest story. And remember last week, I gave you the members of the Western Goals, the board of directors of who they are. We won't go over them again. This is the story. New ACLU suit aims at the right-wing group. 52 organizations and individuals filed a lawsuit just last Wednesday, April the 18th, against Western Goals organization in Alexandria, Virginia. And as I said, you can get my back tapes on Western Goals. The charge is that they violated the rights of these people, that they obtained information about them from the police files, that they distributed through a computer network. They not only did it to the Western Goals, but I'll be in touch with these people. It went to Vienna, to the German intelligence there, and to Germany, to the BND, right into the Galen computer Western Goals goes. The suit was filed with Superior Court Judge Norman L. Epstein, and they went to court this past week, with a temporary restraining order has been issued to keep them from destroying any files in their possession. Once a suit is filed, you can destroy things, and I didn't understand the destruction of evidence until you get a subpoena or an injunction, and they charge that the Western Goals is already destroying these past tapes, and there's a temporary restraining order, which on May the 8th, there will be further hearings for an injunction from them destroying papers. Now, there's 37 defendants and 52 organizations in total. Among them, Joan Baez, Bonnie Raitt, Jackson Brown, Mike Farrell, the producer, Norman Lear, Stanley Scheinbaum, who's a regent of the University of California at Berkeley. So now the heavies are getting into that finally. Some of the organizations include the Alliance for Survival, the American Friends Service Committee, the Coalition Against Police Abuse, the Coalition for Economic Survival, La Raza Unida Party, and I understand that there's an activist there who testified at the earlier trial, Zinzin, who is going to be part of this suit, and he was the one who confirmed for me through Don Freed that this police detective Farwell talked about his contacts with Donald DeFreeze up to the hour when he died, that the SLA became part of this operation. That isn't part of the suit. But I just want to mention that these various organizations and individuals combined, heavyweights now, when Norman Lear has new series on TV, now the heavyweights like Stanley Scheinbaum, the intellectuals, the producers, and the activists are finally going to get into this lawsuit, and they're going to ask more money. The LAPD made a settlement of $1.8 million, and almost $1 million went back to the civil liberties attorney to close the suit. We're not guilty, but we'll close it now. And that money, they wouldn't go to court on that other case. So now there's another trial, and they're going to ask for much, much more money in the suit. And as I say, this is Chapter 2 in the police spying. The attorney is Mark Rosenbaum, and he said these charges are more serious, so the damages should be greater. The charges that John Reese took this stuff and sent it back to Alexandria, Virginia. And furthermore, he has a computer in his own home. That there's a computer in Long Beach, there's a computer in Virginia with the military like Admiral Moore, and going off to the other top, John Singh Lab of the World Anti-Communist League, the general, the avid far right-winger. We won't run down their names all the time. I just keep bringing them up to get the color of the group. This injunction bars all those people, defendants from Western Goals, from storing anymore or transmitting any information that is in their possession that was collected or maintained under the auspices of the Los Angeles Police Department. And of course, Mr. J. Paul is the center of this whole suit. The organizations and individuals are bringing the computer because they are listed in a printout from the computer of an index containing 5,000 to 6,000 entries. We used to live next door to Lloyd Bridges, and I'm close to Dorothy and Lloyd Bridges, Bud Bridges, I always call him Bud. I sent him a letter with his name, his address, and not Jeff Bridges, but his address on Loring, right next to where we used to live, and said, look, you're in John Reese's police intelligence. Do you want to get involved in this? And these are the kind of people that seemed interested, always seemed concerned. They're good friends. He and Dorothy didn't answer my letter. They don't want to be involved. I don't know if they're interested in getting in this suit or not, but their name was part of this, and Bo Bridges also. Their addresses, their phone numbers, what they do is that they give the Klan and the Nazis and the hit teams the locations of where these people live. And sometimes you read about these actors and actresses and producers having car accidents, heart attacks, falling out of places. Well, they disseminate throughout the United States where they are, where they travel, and what they do. Now, a guy named John Ryan is an employee of Western Goals in Virginia, in Alexandria, Virginia, and he worked with a computer and exchanged information with J. Paul. And as I say, the article this week said that the computer also wasn't in Alexandria, Virginia. It was in Reese's home. John Reese is that person I described by way of the FBI last week. His personality, what the FBI thought of him, not what Mae Brussell thinks, but what, and I will do more about John Reese with the computers in his home. Western Goals Foundation was formerly headed, by Larry McDonald. Reese is the editor of their newspaper, Western Goals Report. They asked him, he's been there since 1979, he was the co-founder. They asked him about this lawsuit, and this is what he said. Given the history of the ACLU attorneys to pervert the Constitution, I'm not the least surprised. Now let me ask you, why would the LAPD settle out of court with the ACLU with almost $2 million and never have a day in court if there wasn't a case? If there was a perversion of the Constitution, it's up to the Los Angeles Police Department, second largest city in the United States, to run the police department with law and order. And if the Constitution was done in by the Civil Liberties Union, it was the obligation of the police. If the police bow to the civil liberties as being not obeying the Constitution, then the LAPD has to be totally corrupt, or else admit their guilt, which is what they did. John Reese said this week, it is absolutely amazing that the ACLU would seek to prevent a news reporter. He calls himself a news reporter from exercising his First Amendment right and publishing information. He can publish your address. This is where you live. This is your phone number. He can say, here's Mae Brussell, send it to 50 states, 50 police departments, here's her house. How would you think if I think a guy like John Hinckley, that could be John Hinckley in front of my house, the guy whose name was John, who looked like him, every description about him, and every indication that it never proved that he wasn't. That, how did they get and sit in front of your house? From the John Reese bulletins. What is the First Amendment to tell you where people live, their phone numbers, and how to find their doors? He supplies that to the police department. John Reese works with Western Goals, publishes their material. The lawsuit charged that the information in the Western Goals computer was disseminated to public and private groups, and that's what it was, to private groups, the Klan and the Nazis and the paramilitary and the special forces and the mercenaries, because I can prove they work with them, and they were concerned that these people decide they're concerned about private and political activities. The charge that Western Goals is critical of leftist political orientation and sought to stifle the plaintiff's advocacy of political opinions. This is what the suit is about, and the suit charges the J. Paul superiors up to the chief of police, Daryl Gates, knew and willfully authorized or countenanced went along with his contact. Now that is a suit that was filed this week, and an injunction against these sleazy, talk about sleaze characters, to quit destroying the material. Now Edwin Meese had opinions about the ACLU, and he works with John Reese. In the New Yorker, there was a quotation, July 20th, 1981. This is John Meese. The ACLU is opposed to law enforcement. It is a criminals' lobby. And he wanted to establish a comparable citizens group that represented law-abiding citizens free from criminal activity. So the table has turned, Mr. Meese. You're not going to be the Attorney General. You're not a law-abiding citizen. You're a sleazy character putting down an organization that is trying to keep the Constitution going. Also, he spoke to the police officers, of course. This was in May of '81, not in the New Yorker. And he talked about the rising crime rate in the United States and the criminal lobby. And he referred to the American Civil Liberties Union and the Prisoners Union as two groups that have now formed a consistent lobby which is regularly opposed to law enforcement. Popeye Jackson was head of the United Prisoners Union. He was murdered. I was in his home and saw a danger there. It was 3 weeks before he was murdered. I was sitting at his kitchen table with Popeye Jackson and some of his so-called friends that I felt weren't friends. He was murdered. Sarah Jane Moore, who took a shot at Jerry Ford and worked with alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, she was the one who worked with the Tribal Thumb and the group that did in Popeye Jackson. She was an informer for the government then and now, although she's serving her time, real brainwashed zombie. But she was one of the people that betrayed Popeye Jackson and got him involved. Now, last week I was doing some more on the Los Angeles Police Department. I want to continue with, I have so many articles on them, and we have to keep updating them with the people moving in for the Olympics, with the Alpha 66, the anti-Castro Cubans, the Young Americans for Freedom, the Hells Angels. It's important to weave Edwin Meese, the LAPD, and the people that are going to be there for the Summer Olympics. Now, March 30th, 1983, there was an article in the LA Times. This is the hearing of J. Paul at the police department. Paul concedes that he gave the information and data to John Reese in Washington, D.C. And I'm just going to read you highlights of the article, not the whole article. J. Paul admitted that he passed along confidential department intelligence to the editor of Western Goals, John Reese, and the right-wing organization Western Goals. But he made a distinction before his superiors when he's being questioned. He said, this is the what you call the J. Paul double talk out of 1984. He said he gave information to John Reese, the individual, and he's never been charged with giving police files to John Reese. Now that's very important considering how Reese formed Western Goals with Larry McDonald with the help of J. Peter Grace and Roger Milliken in that background. He said that he only gave material to John Reese and not to Western Goals. But what's the difference? If Reese is the editor for Western Goals, why would he think that Reese wouldn't give it to Western Goals? He's only charged or being apprehended for passing police intelligence documents from California to Western goals. He's not charged sending them to John Reese. Now, who splits those hairs unless they want violence at the time of the Olympics and they're skirting it? So he's not charged with sending it, I repeat it again, to Reese, only with giving to Western goals. So John Reese said, is a publisher and editor, and J. Paul says, I give it to him for his publications. He has other publications, and J. Paul said he met Reese in the late 1970s through the office of Larry McDonald, and Louise Reese, the wife of John Reese, works full-time on the Larry McDonald staff, and J. Paul says he wasn't aware that John Reese was a co-founder with Larry McDonald. Now, here's a man in police intelligence in Los Angeles who is going to work with John Reese. Where is the intelligence, computer, diagrams, fingerprint? John Reese was described by the FBI as not reliable in Newark, as an informer with the riots in 1968 in Chicago. Now we're going to have the Olympic Games in Los Angeles. And here's a man, 10 years with police intelligence, who's trying to separate John Reese forming Western Goals when the Western Goals bought him a $100,000 computer that he said the police let him work with, and he says he didn't get the connection of Reese founding Western Goals. That's what police intelligence is. If you put police files in a computer, why don't you know whose computer it is? Now, J. Paul admitted that it was John Reese who made the contacts with him. John Reese went to the Los Angeles Police Department, where soon the Olympic Games were be planned in Los Angeles, like we're planning 4 years from now in Korea. John Reese initiated the contacts. He arranged for Paul to participate with the project. He arranged for the equipment to go in the office. Now, they asked him about a domestic security report in 1981, and this was prepared in 1981 from the Public Disorder Intelligence Division. February 81 is when a coup was planned in Spain that was stopped. Nazis, part of the Masonic Lodge, Licio Gelli group, it was stopped. March 81 is when Reagan was shot. In May 81 is when the Pope was shot. And in 1981, there was other violence going around in the United States. And they asked him about a report that he had, and he skirted around it. Did he have it? And the technicalities of it, or the dialogue, we don't have time to go into now. He had domestic information from the police department that was marked confidential, from the LAPD, confidential, and this is important, that he put into the Western Goals computer with Reese. And he said, I didn't give it to Western Goals, I gave it to John Reese and a number of other people. Now, these sentences are very important. If there's a hidden government, a government behind the government to overthrow this country, this is a very important line of questioning that took place in L.A. They asked J. Paul about some important documents. Did you send them to Western Goals? And he said, no, I sent them to John Reese and a number of other people who he didn't identify. And they showed him the copies, and they were 2 pieces of information. Now, one of them was the list of 13 people and the circumstances of their arrest in 1981 at the nuclear facility at Crystal River, Florida. John Reese was working with J. Paul, Reese in Alexandria, Virginia, in his home with a computer, with J. Paul in Los Angeles, with the men arrested in Crystal River, Florida. Now, Crystal River was a subject I brought up going back to a planned Reichstag in the United States. I referred to it and Alexander Haig and how Haig wanted to become president. The circumstances of Crystal River I brought up on broadcast 486, March 29th, 1981. That was the night before Ronald Reagan was shot. And I said that Alexander Haig wanted to take over the domestic and foreign emergency power, and Reagan angered him and named Bush for the foreign crisis manager and pushed Haig out. And there were rumors that week that Bush had been shot. Then there was the arrest at Crystal River, Florida, of a commando leader and 12 military Reichstag training for nuclear terror. That's what I put on the sheet that went out with the tape in 1981. I didn't know John Reese and J. Paul were connected. They were passing information. I identified the Crystal River Gang as being part of a future coup in the United States. They're linked to the Klan, the Nazis, the World Anti-Communist League, to the Soldiers of Fortune, to General Westmoreland, to John Singlaub, and Mitchell Werbel, and the whole ball of wax. This was, I referred to as the planning Reichstag, and I was suspicious. They had silencers and submachine guns, and there was a second gun in front of the Hilton Hotel when Ronald Reagan was shot. From in back of him, again, over by that small grassy section from the balcony. There's a man at the balcony. And I had reason to believe that the Crystal River gang that were caught just a few days earlier, had been up at the Hilton Hotel and were involved in that, and that they were part of the attempted coup that would have taken place when Haig said, "I am in charge." And this Crystal River guerrilla warfare was written up in several newspapers at the time, and I have articles on the mercenaries. The people involved in there are a man named Frank Camper, 34 years old, a Vietnam veteran from Dolomite, Alabama, who works with the CIA, who works with alcohol, tobacco, and firearm, who worked in the jungles of Vietnam, Laos, and in the Middle East. They work with automatic rifles, Soviet-made AK-47, the Israeli Uzi submachine gun. In April, 12 of them were caught around the nuclear facility, because the coup that happens in this country will be around a nuclear facility. And yet these men have worked with the soldiers of fortune, the Pentagon. You notice nothing came of their being arrested. They run a small paramilitary group that train in Alabama, that train at Frank Capper's school at Dolomite, Alabama. They work with the federal government. They were picked up in April and they were released. The early part of March, and these men were arrested. It was March 21st. And they were released. Then later in April, they were arrested again, and they were on their way to murder somebody in Florida. But I saw them on NBC News, and it went so fast. It was April the 15th, 1981. They were arrested in March. Then they were caught again in Florida. Mr. Camper was released, and Mr. Lisenby was with him, Lisenby. And these 12 guerrillas near the nuclear plant, they said, "Oh, these are just boys training with their silencers." Another instrument, like I say, was the silencer that was described on television and in the newspapers. And the policeman in Miami stopped them, and NBC News that evening, it was tape recorded, a friend tape recorded, they were on their way to assassinate somebody. You don't hear about Mr. Lisenby. We're reading about terrorists, the terrorists from Gaddafi and the PLO and all over the world. What about these people? Now, this is the gang that Jay Paul was working with and had the names with privately with John Reese in Alexander, Virginia, this particular team. Well, this team later, through their mentors, they work with Soldier of Fortune. They get their instructions from the magazine Soldier of Fortune of where to go and where to fight. This team was involved with the Grenada invasion. When Soldier of Fortune magazine came out, the cover of February 84, Grenada, one that we won, a war we won. The Grenada Papers, the Soldier of Fortune scores intelligence coup in the Caribbean, and there's a picture of Robert K. Brown, a Soldier of Fortune, who runs the ads where the men like Lisenby and Kemper go and answer those ads. They were the first people into the offices of the dead Maurice Bishop to scoop up his papers and get their hands on the evidence. And Soldier of Fortune was bragging about how they were the first people in the room. They were practically the first team that got to the island of the press to get into the private territories. They're working with the federal government, and all branches of our army were down there at Grenada. And these people have trained at places like Crystal River. But the important story is that the Los Angeles Police Department has a man like Jay Paul feeding John Reese and knowing that they are exchanging information about Crystal River. Now, the common denominator between the Crystal River men and the Dominica, the planned coup that just followed shortly after that, they were going to take the island of Dominica and overthrow that. Mrs. Charles, Eugenia Charles, was getting hard on the mafia and didn't want drug traffic there. And they promised the former prime minister that in exchange for overthrowing her on that island, that these members of the Klan and the Nazi Party, armed with the swastika and the German flag, could have Dominica. They'd run the police and they'd run be Minister of Information, and they wanted to take Grenada, and they worked, this group that went in Dominica, worked with Sir Eric Gary, who also lived in Florida and worked with the paramilitary, and they arranged immediately as early as 1979 and 1980 how to go in and take Grenada, and they wanted to take Dominica first. What happened was that a man who was getting the boat for them broke the story, and these people at the Dominican invasion were caught and arrested, but you don't read much about them. Now, those mercenaries that trained in the Alabama woods that were in Florida at Crystal River, you never hear about Mr. Camper, you never hear about Lisenby, but the men that they've trained with the military operations are going to be with those people in Los Angeles in the Olympic Games demonstrations. That is the Klan and the Nazi Party from California, who originally, Mr. Brown and that group worked with Charles Willoughby and General Douglas MacArthur and got the full accord of alcohol, tobacco, and firearms like the Hells Angels did during the anti-war movement, and they will be carrying that torch along with other people. Robert Vesco worked with them. There's suggestions that he put up the money for these people. Vesco also worked with Bernard Cord and funded him, and he killed Maurice Bishop, and that was excuse for the Americans and the mob to take over Grenada. The Klan story, the Dominica story, goes into men in Texas who funded it, $40,000, $50,000, with contacts to the former governor, John Conley. Some of the men involved with the Dominica invasion plot and who linked directly to that Crystal River group. There's a George Malvaney, Malvaney, from Jackson, Mississippi. He helped plan the Klan rally in Virginia Beach, Virginia, October 1979, while he was still in the Navy. Remember Mr. Scheidecker from Navy Intelligence, who took papers home like J. Paul, whose name faded away out of the Los Angeles news? He's in the U.S. Navy Intelligence. This guy ran the Klan rally at Virginia Beach while he was still in the Navy. Michael Perdue was the man who raised the money for this invasion in Texas. Stephen Black from Birmingham, Alabama, is the Grand Wizard of the Knights of the Klan. Wolfgang Droege, D-R-O-E-G-E, a native of Forchheim, West Germany, F-O-R-C-H-E-I-M, West Germany, is the organizer of the Associated Canadian Knights of the Klan, affiliated with the Klan of Tuscumbia, spell it T-U-S-C-U-M-B-I-A, Tuscumbia, Alabama, headed by Mr. Black, the Grand Wizard of the Klan. Now, what they were going to do if they took Dominica was to run that island with the drug traffic, the casinos. They were in a position to have businesses there, and they were to be in control of all the forest and lumber of that little island and have the job of minister of propaganda, keep their Nazi flag on the island. And again, these people are not a fringe group. These people link directly with Sir Eric Gary and the United States government, people like Robert McNamara and Robert Pastor, and the intelligence community, Mr. Califano, the former Deputy Defense Secretary. The Klan and the Nazis and the Soldiers of Fortune work together. There isn't any difference between John Singlaub of Western Goals or Mr. Lisenby from Alabama or training around the nuclear plants with their silencers and their machine guns. Now, this is the group that it turns out J. Paul of the Los Angeles Police Department is working with John Reese in Reese's home with computers. He has the names of all these people. He works with them. That is what is warming up for Los Angeles. If the new postage stamp on the National Archives says the past is just the prologue, you better believe it's catching up now. I mean, now it is time to realize that none of these people have paid their dues for the violence they caused in this country. They have been given immunity. The group with the Dominican invasion plans, I think, got 3 years. They'll be out in another year or so, maybe on time for the Olympics. Well, have a good Olympic game in Los Angeles, but we'll be doing more about Edwin Meese because he was in the Justice Department in California when the roots for all of this was set up. Edwin Meese, who would be your Attorney General for that big celebration in Los Angeles. This is Mae Brussell, and our time is up now. Another hour has passed. I'll be back with you on World Watchers next week. You take care and read all those papers.